Here's a tip that might help you in something you're working on at the moment. It's a Jason Joshua methodology, and I've heard other people talk about it, but he's the one that most prominently mentions this stuff a lot. He'll always pick a winning frequency when things compete. Now, a lot of people think about this in the low end, but think about this in the area that might hurt your ears, like when a snare drum plays at the same time as a hi-hat. That's a very common thing to happen. And what a lot of people will do is they might just EQ the hi-hat and EQ the snare drum. The problem is if you wind up boosting, let's say between 3 and 8K on maybe one or both of those things, and even if you don't boost much, they double up the power of that transient. You hear like twice as much of it every time the snare and the hat are played together because they're both going to hit your ear and bite it in that 3 to 10K range, for example. So what a lot of guys do, especially Jason Joshua, and this is why his mixes sound as good as they do, is he'll always pick a winning frequency. So that means if the snare is kind of it's a sharp sounding snare, he may dull the front of that snare so that the transient isn't as vicious, but he'll use parallel compression to pull up everything behind the transient because the length of the snare is what is going to give it its power. That's what's going to make you feel like it's a good, big sounding snare. It's not usually just the tick in the front, that little tick of a transient. It's what happens after it. So if the hi-hat is playing at the same time as a snare, he might pick the hi-hat to run the show for those moments that the snare hits. And then behind the snare, like after the transient, he'll use parallel compression to bring up the body of the snare. Now, he may do that with harmonics, with some kind of saturation. Like, for example, the Little Radiator plugin by Sound Toys is really good for when you turn the heat up on that plugin. It's like 250 to 800 hertz in that zone. So you can bring up a lot of body of something in, harmonics that won't necessarily be the same. It's not going to sound the same as boosting EQ, and it will also kind of just thicken it up. So when you think about this, it's not only snare and hi-hat, it could be, any sort of like Congo lines, or it could be vocals. Let's talk about vocals. Vocals exist 8K, 10K, and there's a lot of ways to deal with this stuff, but the most common way I'd say these days is through multiband or dynamic EQ, because you could really control when the snare, for example, plays at the same time as the hi-hat. Maybe in those moments you want to duck the snare, but if it's a sparse track and there's less hi-hats, maybe the rest of the time you don't want to duck the snare because it would be taking too much out of the snare. It's not like that hi-hat exists on top of it all the time. If that's the case, use a multiband or a dynamic EQ to only when the signals reach a certain threshold will it then take it down. So I like that a lot as a concept, and I also think, people do some side chaining sometimes where you could side chain, every time the hat plays, the snare will duck a little bit. So when the hat's not playing, the snare stays where it is. So you just, put a side chain on the snare itself, fed from the hi-hat. So the hi-hat's cueing the chain on the snare. That's a way you could do it. Some people do, and I'm a little reluctant to do this, but a lot of people put like on their all music bus, they might side chain everything down in relation to the vocal, cueing a side chain to duck the entire music bus. Your all music, if you've got like, a bunch of instruments, that all gets to one place maybe, and then you put a side chain on there to every time the vocal comes in, it ducks stuff out of the way just a little bit as a whole to give space for the vocal. I have a tendency to not like to do that. I'd rather sort of fit the vocal in the track from the beginning, and then I build the track around the vocal. That always seemed to make the most sense for me. I'll always start with everything in, but I don't like wait till the end to get the vocal right. Most of the time I'm dealing with the vocal from the beginning, getting my balance of everything, and I will immediately go to make the vocal sound as good as I can. Because the way I always visualize it is once the vocal is comfortable sitting where it wants to be, you can really decide how much room you want other things to take up. One other tip I want to throw in here that Jason Joshua loves, and I think it's a really cool, it's stock plugin stuff from Pro Tools. So let me just show you what it looks like. But these kind of things. If you've ever seen this, the PS22 spread, this is he'll often keep this on like frequency of 411. You see this? And then with the center at 724. So a lot of this is actually just I mean, if you just default it, I'm just curious where it defaults to when you, full reset looks like this. So he is tweaking it quite a bit to get it to this. And by doing this, he'll basically put the spread on first and then this split. And he won't always do this, but this is something that he has on his high-end percussion. And that kind of gets it out of the way. So think about this kind of thing when you're dealing with background vocals. Maybe you want to get that out of the center so it's kind of wrapped around you instead of competing with all your center information like lead vocal. So you may want to get that stuff split wide for synths, guitars, pianos, high-end percussion stuff. He even has it on a low-end percussion, the same kind of thing. Spread first and then the split after. And these are stock Pro Tools plugins. So I just find when you deal with the spatial field, the sound field, that often will do more than like carving EQ out, because this makes everything feel more 3D and gives you depth. And if you just take everything and sort of just notch EQs here and there, it doesn't do the same thing. The other thing you should keep in mind is when you're trying to create that spatial relationship and depth, use darkness, like just rolling the highs off of something to make it feel farther away, and use, up in your face, the brightness of it to make it sound close. And in addition, if you want it to sound even closer, that's where you would use something like parallel compression. And one of my favorite tools for parallel is definitely the MV2. I've mentioned it before, but there's nothing like using an MV2 and taking the low-level information and bringing it up to really make something feel like it's right in your face. Like it couldn't get much closer than using like an MV2. Jason Joshua also mentioned that when you use CLA vocals, the compress channel on CLA vocals is a parallel compression. It's not just compressor, like a compressor sitting there. It's like, the way that plugin was designed is when you bring that up, it's bringing it up a parallel version of it, which is similar to like the MV2. It's not the same, but I love that MV2 plugin because it works on 808s, it works on vocals, it works anything you want to bring stuff up on. You could use it on effects, you could use it on anything. So play with those things. If you don't have the Waves MV2, really critical, amazing, very cool plugin. And if you don't have Pro Tools with this stuff, I'm sure there's another type of plugin out there where you can deal with spatial field. I'm sure Ozone does this in some way. The stereo field, where you can basically control like which frequencies you wind up spreading, which is basically what this is doing. So, he has that set at that one at 411 and then this one at 251. So it's just like, and I feel like he won't always use these together, but I have seen him use it together also. So play with this stuff. Mess with your stereo field. A lot of times with background vocals, I'll do a similar thing where you could use like the doubler plugin and kind of remove the center of it and just have it get out super wide. That's a cool thing to do too. My goal is always to give you as many ideas as I can so you guys can try this stuff out on your own. If there's something I explained that you didn't quite get, feel free, throw it in the comments. I'm happy to get back to you, and there's other guys over here who will also answer your questions. I appreciate hitting the like button, subscribe if you haven't already. You guys got this. Evan Jaffe, Custom Cut Studios. Take it easy. You got this.